British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Good afternoon. On behalf of our festival co-directors, Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, festival producer, Teamwork Arts, and the British Library, we welcome all of you to this session of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation UK and our patron, the Murty Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our next session is The Lost Children, Deepa Anappara in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy. Sanjoy K. Roy and Deepa Anappara embark on a journey to the heart of childhood and the heartbreak and loss of innocence in Deepa Anappara's debut novel, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line. Sanjoy K. Roy, Managing Director of Teamwork Arts, is the founder-trustee of Salaam Balaak Trust. Anappara worked as a journalist in India, reporting on the impact of poverty and religious violence on the education of children. Deepa Anappara worked as a journalist in India and is currently studying for a PhD at the University of East Anglia, Norwich. Her debut novel, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line, was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Sanjoy K. Roy is an entrepreneur of the arts. He's managing director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 25 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts and literary festivals across 40 cities. Roy works closely with various industry bodies. All of our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org. All of our sessions, if you follow our handles, JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions, and in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, don't despair, you can log back on at london.jlflitfest.org. We encourage you to keep JLF London at the British Library a free festival by donating generously. Ladies and gentlemen, The Lost Children, Deepa Anappara in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy. Over to you, Sanjoy.
Thanks so much, Anna, and welcome, Deepa, and congratulations for this brilliant work that you've done, your first book.
Yes, thank you so much, Sanjoy, and thanks to everyone at JLF for having me here. It's such a privilege.
So, Deepa, a lot of people, a lot of our viewers looking at both our hairstyles may think that we are mental. You know, what really I loved, your characters really came alive. I'm with Salaam Balaak Trust, and all your characters sort of spoke to me. Tell me a little bit about how you actually were able to get so much into the skin of folks like mental and the dadas and the smoking. Tell me your journey in writing this book.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you felt that way, and it means a lot coming from you. I worked as a journalist in India for over a decade, and most of that time I spent interviewing children about, the education, why they were not in school, and street children as well. And I did speak to many people working in various charities, including those at the Salaam Balaak Trust. And so it was during the time that, I came across both these children and the various people who inspired many of the characters in the novel, such as Mental, who sort of runs this group of children rat pickers at the railway station. It's very much based on people who did exist at one point of time. And, there's sort of amalgamation of various characters, many of whom I interviewed in real life. So when I was working as a journalist, and because, my primary focus was children, their rights, that's when I came to know about these disappearances of children, which I think most of us in India know that, who live in India, they know that it's a very frequent experience. It's very common, but we don't really pay much attention to it. And I'm still not sure why that is, why there's a sort of apathy towards disappearances of children. But there were neighborhoods where, 10 or 20 children had gone missing. And there was no concerted effort made to find these children, either on the part of the police or various governmental institutions. And the parents, their friends, the children's friends, they were sort of ignored. And because, the angle from which I always approached my news stories was through the eyes of children, I was wondering what would be their experience living in a neighborhood where disappearances were commonplace. How did they make sense of that horror, and how did they understand what was happening around them? And, as a child, you don't fully understand what's going on. So how do you make sense of, a friend disappearing? And my idea at that time was that I would write a report about it at some point. But, my life changed, and I ended up moving from India to the UK, but sort of those stories and those characters, they remained in my head. And at some point, I decided to sort of approach that story through the eyes of children, because I think when it comes to the disappearances of children, A, it's not discussed at all, and B, we never know what the children themselves feel, living in such a situation. So my interest was always in exploring this world through their eyes and their experiences and how they make sense of it.
Earlier today, Deepa, I was talking to Lady Mohini Noon about, because she also works in trafficking, and we were just sharing a statistic that every 8 minutes somewhere in India a child goes missing. So When you're looking at the numbers, you're absolutely right. And while the laws are in place, and the Juvenile Justice Act in India is is very substantial, it's still, because they are the missing people, they're the little people with no vote, no voice, and you've pretty much captured that. Well, before we go back to the book, I had a question. Most people's first novels tend to be about home, identity, and you come from God's own country, Kerala, which obviously is the setting for so much of wonder, beauty, exoticism, and yet you chose to write about a completely different reality, which was these kids in slums and in disappearing alleyways.
It's I think the novel is really, my fiction is often an extension of the work that I had done as a journalist. And so when I was a journalist, I was not writing on lifestyle and fashion, and sometimes when you're working for a newspaper, you have to write what the editor tells you to do. But primarily my focus was definitely, in the last few years when I was working as a journalist in India, I was freelancing. And I was very much focused on writing about those issues, which are close to my heart, and which is essentially about poverty and how that affects children, and especially children's education. So it's, if I didn't have that experience as a journalist, I would not have been able to write this book. So it's pretty much closely linked to the work that I've done as a journalist, which sort of gave me access to these neighborhoods and to people. Because when you're a journalist, it's one way to, you can get away by asking people the kind of questions that you can't ask if you're just a stranger. You can't ask a stranger walking down the road the sort of questions that you can ask as a reporter, particularly when you're writing about a certain kind of subject. And what I found was that people were always interested in sharing those stories because they were not getting an opportunity to be heard often. So those experiences really did feed into my fiction. I also have to say, it is my first published novel, but it's not my first novel. I wrote 2 books before this, which didn't go anywhere. The first one was set in Kerala, which is landscape familiar to me and, very much drawn from my own life, but it didn't, it wasn't good enough. And it was a long journey. It took me sort of about 10 years. This is a book that I wanted to write back in India when I was working as a journalist, about 2006, 2007. That's when I had the idea first. And by the time I got to actually writing it, it was, almost a decade later. So it's a book that's had a sort of long gestation period in my head.
Yeah, the other thing that's fascinating with the way you've written it is you've really brought alive the voices of the different kids, and certainly the protagonist who goes out to search for his friend and friends who've disappeared. And the way that you've used language and the way that you've laid the book out is absolutely, it's beautiful. But, I've been in the midst of trying to edit our 30-year story for Salaam Balaak Trust, which is written by Sujata Raghavan. And one of the things my colleagues and I, Geetan and Anupam, have been struggling with is, how do you tell the story without it being in their language, in their voice? And similarly, when you write in English, as you've done, how do you actually get the nuance, extend the words that these kids have, which find it very difficult to translate? Tell us a little bit about how you were able to do that.
It was really difficult. And I think, when you're writing in English, there is a sense that something is missing, something is getting lost in translation. And that's always a worry that I have. And with this particular book, especially because it's a child narrator, even, when you're writing, even if the child is thinking in English, it's quite hard to capture a child's voice in English itself, because the reader is an adult reader, and there's only so much patience that people have with, a child's voice. Unless it's their own child, nobody wants to listen to them for 3 or 4 hours at a time. So it's something that I was very conscious of. And for me, with Jai's voice, and I also think part of the reason I couldn't write this book was not only because, it was about a tragedy, and it was about people who don't have much. And I was worried about my own authority to write that. So those questions were there. But beyond that, for me, I couldn't really write it until I had Jai's voice. And I think part of it came from sort of writing lots of short stories in the voices of children, watching movies which had child narrators, and also reading books with child narrators. And what I learned, what I could learn from that was that even though if the language that you can use when you're writing from a child's point of view is quite simple, you can still sort of stylistically capture the neologisms, use the sort of slang that they use to create a voice which is very unique to them. In the case of Jai, because he's thinking in Hindi with a smattering of Urdu, what I wanted to do was to capture the sort of rhythm of his voice and, the rhythm of the language, which is very different from the rhythm of English. So I had to retain a few of the Hindi and Urdu words that is in his vocabulary. And children also have that tendency to sort of, repeat the same word over and over again, or if they have a favorite word, they'll use it several times in conversation. So those were the sort of traits that I picked up from real life, and I sort of tried to bring to Jay's voice and try to add to that. So that was essentially the process. It was, when I was writing him, I have to say it was a lot more intuitive. It was, now when I'm saying it, it sounds like I've kind of analyzed everything. But for me, his voice really sort of, came to me fully formed.
The book is being touted as the 2020 sort of Slumdog Millionaire or Q&A equivalent, and I'm sure you've heard this all the time. But what was really amazing, as we know, India lives in many realities at the same time. We have slums, we have high-rise buildings, as you have shown. But what was fascinating is the way that you've actually depicted the slum, not necessarily as this exotic place, but as a place which was home, a place that, however small it is, and however limited the spaces, it still resonates for the children and the characters in your story, and the real lives that these people live, and the real tragedies and their tribulations and traumas, etc. And tell us a little bit about this juxtaposition. Omi going off to the high-rise buildings with his with the clothes that his father's ironed, and as he delivers them, in some not so fancy buildings and in some fancy buildings, and comes back, but never comes back with a sense of, jealousy or coveting something, but comes back with a different reality. Tell us a little bit about this, both in your journalism as well as, of course, in Djinn Patrol.
My experience as a journalist is that people were very aware, and in fact, children were very aware of what they did not have, but not necessarily they saw themselves as victims. And I think perhaps that's been your experience. I'm not really sure, but they know they don't have certain things, but it doesn't mean that, children are pretty much focused on the present. And especially in the case of kids like, my character Jay and his friends Pari and Faiz, they have they have got stability of home in the sense that they have parents who love them. So it's not that, they're very much rooted in what they can achieve in that moment and in that hour, in the second, because that's how children are. They live for the moment. And so for me, writing from their point of view was very liberating, because I think, when you're writing about poverty, there's always the risk that you're sort of accused of stereotyping, presenting certain stereotype about India. And I was very aware of those discussions and those debates. But for me, it was really about inhabiting these children's viewpoints, because they are very focused on what they are interested in. They're interested in food, they're interested in TV, or, in Pari's case, she's interested in books. And they're not really beyond that, it's a sort of their attitude, their viewpoint is quite nebulous as to what they covet or what they don't. And so even in the case of a boy like Umair, he's very much focused on his dancing and, he likes Hrithik Roshan. So that's where most of his thoughts lie. So what I wanted to do in writing this book, just to avoid all those sorts of traps that you can fall into when you're writing about poverty, because, you either end up showing people as victims or you end up showing, everyone who's poor has a heart of gold. And I just wanted to avoid doing any of that. And the only way to do it was to sort of really fully inhabit the lives of these characters and just view the world as these children view it. And so for me, it was, as an adult would have felt a sort of sense of oppression perhaps, and, may have felt much more anger. But these, because they're just 9, they haven't reached, that's not how they view the world. For them, everything is a sort of, there's, at least in the beginning, there's a sense of adventure, there's a sense of play. Even the disappearances of their friends, they're approaching it as a mystery, because that's just how children tend to be.
There's a saying that when you're young, you're able to sense the other world or spirits or beings from the other world much more than as you grow older. And pretty much from the beginning of the book, in the smog, I won't even call it fog because you look at it as smog and the grittiness, which you've used so effectively, whether it's to describe somebody's hairstyle and how it changes in the smog, etc. But the jinn inhabits the space, and the mother at the crossroad, and you use that so symbolically as she fights in many ways for her daughter who was abducted and raped and dropped back, and then the way she saves, or she's allegedly supposed to save the life of this girl standing at exactly the same spot, and the many jinns that inhabit your work. And that was, again, unusual and different, and an entirely different character, pretty much like the smog and the kids.
I wanted to capture the sense of sort of mythology that can permeate, street life, for instance, in that people sort of see children, especially street children, can see ghosts everywhere. And there's a sort of belief that, in that part, certain part, a ghost lives, and this ghost can grant wishes or act against you. And those are certain beliefs that children, especially when they don't have the support of sort of families or schools and other government institutions or non-government institutions, they can form those sort of beliefs to guard themselves, especially if they are living on the street. For them, it's a source of comfort and solace, which is what I had witnessed when I was working as a reporter. So I did want to bring that into this story. And especially in this particular story, when children are disappearing from this neighborhood, and the parents in this neighborhood are not getting the help of the government institutions, they're not getting the help of the police or politicians or people who are meant to be supporting them. So it is to sort of they're approaching this very spiritual path in a sense, and seeking the support of these mythological beings because they're not getting the support from the sources that we often turn to. So I did want to indicate that as well. And in general, there is a belief system in Jai's community that, this is a place in which ghosts and spirits and jinns live. And it's a sense of sharing, that space with people who have passed on and who may be sort of guarding you and will fight, your battles on your behalf. Will intervene on your behalf. So I wanted to capture that, and which is why I sort of included these stories. And it's the kind of stories that, at least long ago I used to hear, especially around Delhi. And the story about the jinns is essentially based on the real place, the real fort in Delhi as well.
And pretty much you go between one recognizes in some way that you go between a Delhi and a Bombay, between the different realities, or a Delhi and a Gurgaon. But going back to the jinns for a second, one of the things that pretty much early in the book and that you talk about really is the whole issue of drugs and the kids. And, when the kids go and mental just doesn't, tolerate it, and he stubs his a cigarette into them if they come. I don't think many of our listeners will understand what glue sniffing is all about. So will you just enlighten everybody on that, and I will move.
It's many street children, especially for them, using glue sticks is a way of, it's an addiction, and it makes you high. So I've seen kids put it inside plastic bags and then sort of sniff it. And for a few moments, I guess, you get a sense of reprieve from the enormous pain or sort of hunger that the children themselves may be experiencing. So it is, unfortunately, it is a truth that many people on the streets end up using various drugs and glue for just to be able to survive being on the streets. So that's what the particular scene indicates. But for the boys, this sort of mythological story about this man named Mendel and his ragtag group of boys who sort of pick up bottles, discarded bottles. And he is in a sense, he discourages them from doing that. And even if he's doing that through an act of cruelty, which is by, stubbing out a cigarette on his skin, they understand that they see it as this man doing it for their own good. That was the difference, yeah.
When the kids step out to start investigating where these kids have disappeared, and obviously nobody knows where that story is going to go to. But again, what is fascinating is the way that you've given them that voice and allowed them to question whether it's the social worker in the trust, as you have described it, or the police, or people who, and the frustration that Jay and Pari and all feel when they're not heard, and their sense of that, if I was a detective of a particular age, they would have listened to me, they would have taken me seriously. And again, one of the things we've seen with our street kids, and because we do a very strong arts program with them, is their thing is that, bhaiya, this is the first time that we feel somebody is listening to us. All the time, either we're shouted at, or people don't even acknowledge our existence. And this is the first, and how important that is. And that's so important in your book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with children especially, there is a sense that, no one is interested in what they have to say. And many of the kids that I met and interviewed, they were very smart and they were very sarcastic, and, they could just give it back to you, as they had ways of surviving this sort of horrible reality that they had been thrust in. And so they were very intelligent, and, not to make it sound patronizing or anything, but what remained with me was that how sarcastic they could be, and they could just tell you off, and as you're asking questions, they just get bored and they'll roll their eyes at you because they don't want to talk about this. And I did want to capture that sense of independence and freedom that they have, and also that sense of agency, which the sort of world refuses to grant them that agency. But they don't see themselves as people without agency. And part of the reason why Djinn Patrol is essentially a book about the kind of stories that people tell themselves. So Jay is telling himself the story that, he's a detective and he can crack this case and the problem will be solved. Part of the reason is that's a way in which he's granting himself agency in this society that's denying it to him. And this is what I'd seen in real life, and I wanted to capture that in the book as well.
Tell us a little bit about the name, Purple Line, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line, and set the context of that.
Just briefly, I'll summarize what the book is about. It's about 3 children who are looking for their missing friends on the outskirts of an unnamed Indian city. And the main narrator is 9-year-old Jay, and he's the one who watches detective shows and sort of trashy cop shows and thinks he's a detective and he can solve missing, the cases of their children going missing in their neighborhood. So he sets out on this mission with his friends, Pari and Faiz, and they think it's going to be this sort of adventure, but events soon take a sinister turn. And so Faiz has this theory that it's jinns who are snatching the children in their neighborhood. So essentially, it begins as a sort of Djinn Patrol, and are they going to find these these otherworldly creatures that are spiriting away their friends, hence Djinn Patrol. And Jay's neighborhood, which is an impoverished one, lies next to this purple line, which connects his neighborhood on the outskirts of the city to the main city center, and that's a purple line. And so for Jay, his dad worked on the purple line, and he was one of the construction workers, but they don't have the money to go on the metro every day. So for him, it's also a symbol of aspiration and this life that is in a sense within reach, but also not at all. So I wanted to capture that sort of dichotomy of its existence by referring the purple line. But quite literally, they travel on the purple line once. The investigations take them to the city, and so it's they have to sort of find the money, and that's a whole sort of adventure in itself. Just ensuring that they can travel on the purple line. But I did want to both of them together because it's it's happening along this purple line. It's also sort of metaphor for the life that these kids could have.
And again, when you talk about the purple line, you have infused each of these kids with ambition, and you've given them a sense of being able to break out. And even then, even as you've seen the impact of COVID-19 and on the migrant population in Delhi and Bombay and everybody having to move back, you're stuck with this image that pretty much in your book as well, where they're these people who build our fancy homes and offices and multi-stories, and as you said, even built the Purple Line. But they can never really ever think of inhabiting the spaces that they build. And then they go back at the end of their tenure back to their slum or their shanty town, and that disconnect. And yet they're happy in their world.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for the children, I think because Jay pretty much has everything he needs in his own house. He's got loving parents, and he's got his TV, which is his favorite thing. So for him, that's quite a comfortable life in many ways. I think they do understand that this is, it is a very precarious existence, and that, this neighborhood is always under the threat of demolition. And at some level, he does understand that, and so do the other children. So it is not that, definitely with the others, I think there is a sense of frustration of how they have to live and what they are denied. So, but within that space, as is often the case, I think, you draw that sense of family and you draw that sense of support from the community around you. And for Jay's parents too, the support is coming from, the community and their neighbors. So even though there's a lot of gossip and sort of terrible things might be said about you, and there's also this sort of divisions that can be sown on the basis of religion, despite all that, they also have friends, and those are the people that sort of help them get along and go on with their daily lives.
The other thing that, you talked about religion, the other thing that permeates through the story is the division between the communities, etc. And you've done that, so subtly. It was, I didn't realize, in fact, Jay was Jay. I kept thinking that maybe he was from a minority community forever into the book, because it was so beautifully delineated. But still, you talk about that. Tell us a little bit, both wearing your journalist hat and as well as your writer hat, how you look at that division between communities and how you see that playing out, especially in congested places like the Dharavis of the world or the Yamuna Bastis of the world, or the slums where everybody's cheek by jowl, and what's the impact thereof if you're from a minority community or from a majority community.
So when I was working as a journalist, I did write very specifically about how religious violence affected children and their education. And what I had discovered in my interviews, and which I think is still quite true, is that if you're displaced by religious violence, you often lose schooling as a result, because your parents tend, especially if you're a girl, your parents tend to keep you at home. They don't want you to go out because they don't think it's safe. So it has an immediate detrimental effect on the children. It affects their future. It affects their education. So it was something that I was very aware of. And with children, when I would interview them, they would say things such as, very subtle things, such as, there was, for instance, there's a story, one of the people who are working in education with children from both communities, one of the stories that they told me was they organized a cricket match so that the kids would get along. And the match sort of ended in chaos because, people are calling each other India and Pakistan, and this sort of, it ended in, all these names being traded. So even with kids, I think they sort of pick up cues from what they see in the adult world around them and what they see on TV. And so I was aware that, it is, I think wealth can insulate you quite a bit from, what's happening in daily life. But if you're sort of living in the neighborhood, the kind of neighborhood that Jay is, there's no avoiding the kind of religious conflict or, conflict based on caste that takes place in India even today, sort of every day. And yeah, so in the novel, I did want to capture that, but not sort of as he would view it and as he would experience it. And yeah, so that's what I try to do essentially.
I'm going to have to open it up to questions as they keep streaming in, but I wanted to just ask you one thing. We've seen that given a platform, street children or children from difficult circumstances, etc., can really, reach for the moon. They can dream and they can achieve their dreams. And in many ways, you've also talked about some of that. In your experience, if you tell our viewers a little bit about why these kids are who they are, and you touched very briefly on it a little while ago where you said, they can be cheeky, they can answer you back, they can buy and sell you 1,000,000 times. Give us a sense of who these young kids are on the platforms and the stations and in the slums.
So, I mean, I guess, in different circumstances, they would be like any other kid. They would be going to school and they would be interested in what a sort of middle class children do. Just like they're essentially like kids anywhere else. But I do want to add that with this book, I didn't want to say that these children are very unique and, that is why they shouldn't disappear. And that is why, we have to work to sort of, that wasn't the viewpoint that I wanted to convey. And it's not something I believe in. I think everyone deserves a chance, an opportunity, and irrespective of what your sort of qualities are, you don't need to be an extraordinary child and highly intelligent, just to say that you shouldn't be trafficked. No one should be trafficked and no one should be suffering those sort of circumstances, and no one should have to live in a neighborhood where abductions are frequent and there's no help coming from any institution. So it's I think, in many ways, Jay is quite an ordinary child. He's not the smartest kid, not even in the book, and not in his house, even in his house. And that is, for me, it was really important to say that, every child deserves a chance, and you can't really say, the kid deserves a chance because this is a mathematics and, he's going to go on and discover Microsoft or Apple or something. That's not important. And that's not what I thought. It was not what I wanted to convey at all. I wanted to say that every child, and, depending on what your circumstances are, if you're offered certain choices, there is a certain trajectory their lives can take. And what's happening currently, and especially I think even particularly with the lockdown and with the sort of job loss that's happened with COVID-19, is that, many children are not even getting food, forget access to schools. So it really doesn't matter who these kids are, or, it's I think what's important is that everyone should have a fair chance at life, which many of these children are not getting.
Deepa, you're absolutely right. The fact it's their right. It's their right. They have a right to education, a right to a safe space to sleep at night, a right to a warm meal. These are their rights. So, it's not about giving it to them and behaving like we're doing them a big deal. I'm going to open it up to questions. So Nicole says, what are the challenges in writing from the perspective of a child, particularly in stories that can become as dark as Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line? And I'm going to add a second question from Prachit, who says, in what ways do you believe that forms of art such as writing can help impact and instigate significant social change?
Oh, wow. So I'll answer the first question, which is about the difficulties in writing from a child's perspective. So absolutely, it is a really difficult subject. But in many ways, for me to approach the issue of children's disappearances from Jai's voice, who is just 9, it offered me an opportunity to sort of leave in this really dark story with some lightness, because he has a very unique way of looking at the world. And, he sort of wears these rose-tinted glasses and he doesn't see things for what they are. And he's only 9, so there's, his understanding is limited. So for me, that was a way to sort of avoid staying in his head was a sort of way of, avoiding any sort of commentary which might seem sort of patronizing or condescending or even polemical. One way to avoid all that was to just follow this child and his viewpoint. So for me, that was helpful. The challenges in writing his voice definitely is, the challenges in writing any child narrator, which is that there is limited sort of, with language, you can't use a sort of advanced vocabulary. And especially because the language in which he's thinking is different, as we already spoke about. How do I convey his sort of voice in English? So those were the sort of challenges that I had to work through. With regards to the second question about, cannot make a change, I think, I became a journalist because I thought I was a very idealistic person when I was younger. And so definitely there is, I do hope that there is some change and that it makes people view the world in a different way. Perhaps, if you're reading from a viewpoint that you're not familiar with, it offers you a different vantage point, a different perspective on the events that are taking place around you. So that was definitely that is my hope. But I don't really know if, art can create change, the kind of, sort of immediate change. I think that comes from society, and art often reflects what is happening in society.
And can present a truth to society.
Yeah, and I mean, it can offer us a way of understanding something that's happened. So it offers a different perspective, but it's often not simultaneous, I would say.
Yeah. Two more questions. Kamia asks, many of us view predicaments such as religious violence and poverty as issues so overwhelming and amorphous that an individual's action cannot impact them. What advice or experience would you share with those who wish to help but don't know how or don't know where to start? And let me add Akshita's question. In your debut novel, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line, what began as a game among children evolves into something much more sinister. Is this insidious danger something you often see reflected in the reality of underprivileged homes?
Yeah, definitely. I'm just answering the
first one. How do you start? Oh, the second one.
Okay. Oh, sorry. What? Sorry.
Wait. The first one is how can you help?
Okay. I'll just answer that. Yeah. So with help, I think it's definitely you can help with your wallets at this moment when we can't go out of our homes if you can't. And there are so many organizations such as Salaam Balaak Trust, which is working in this area, and which is doing extremely good work with children and underprivileged children. So, I would say support these organizations in any way you can and sort of volunteer with them. So, and also I think as a society, I'm not sure why we are so apathetic towards what's happening, because I think people, this is related to the second question as well, which is that people say, how can you write about poverty? It's such a stereotypical representation of India. But at the same time, no one would say that if you're writing about domestic violence. No one would say, domestic violence is over, that's not Indian society, or you would not make such a comment publicly. And I think part of the reason is that we don't see poverty as a violence against, humans, against fellow human beings. And I think there has to be a sort of attitude change about what's happening. And we've sort of become desensitized to seeing these photos of children who are going missing in our newspapers. And we focus always on, I think, things that are not important at all, as we're seeing today. So I think there has to be a change just to come from within the society as well. And in sort of how do you approach writing about the subject? Was that the question, Sanjoy?
Yes, and let me add another part to it, because Anubhav has now sent time out to us, but I'm going to quickly ask to that question of yours. I'm going to ask, how does one write about conditions of poverty in a way that is accurate and poignant, but not overpowering? And Kriti asks, what would you share with aspiring writers on confronting insecurity?
So with regards to writing about poverty, I think, again, what I said during this session, which is that you really focus on how does a character view the world. And, if it is not something that a child would think, then I didn't add that in the, if I'm seeing something, my response as an adult is quite different, whereas this is not how a child views it. And their perspective is completely different, even sort of vertically, they're shorter, and what they see and what they focus on is completely different from that of an adult. So I think that is what we have to, as writers, I think, the best way to approach these subjects is to really focus on what is the character view. And I mean, obviously you have to have an understanding of, the subject, I guess, that goes without saying. With regards to writers' insecurities, I think you just have to sort of persist and keep writing. If it's something that you really want to write about, even in the face of rejections, you have to persist and just read more and try to figure out more about the craft, I guess.
Deepa, thank you so much for bringing alive the stories of street children. Truly, absolutely brilliant, brilliant book. And while Jay may be well frightened of JCB and a slap from his mother, I hope in no way that stops you from winning the JCB award at some point of time. So congratulations. Thank you all for being here. Ankur, over to you. Sorry for taking so much of additional time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjoy, and thank you once again, Deepa, for being part of JLF London, and congratulations for the beautiful book. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all for watching and being a terrific audience. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation, for their support. We hope that you will stay with us for all our sessions today, and will join us tomorrow to watch more of our fabulous program at the JLF London at the British Library. Our next session that will begin shortly is The Color of Words. Abir Mukherjee, Guy Gunaratne, Aruni Kashyap, and Nikesh Shukla in conversation. We now present to you a short reading featuring Shazia from the University of York.
Hi everyone, I'm here to share with you reflections on my favourite poem, and the poem that I've chosen comes from a collection that was published in 2011 by the poet Warsan Shira. Warsan Shira is a British Somali poet who won the Young Poet Laureate of London Award in 2014 and who had a fantastic collaboration with Beyonce on Beyonce's iconic album Lemonade, which came out in 2016. And Shira's poetry is interwoven throughout that album. It's kind of the spine or the backbone of that album. The poem that I want to share with you today comes from a collection that's called Teaching My Mother How to Give Birth, and it's called Tea with Our Grandmothers. And I'll start just by reading it out loud. The morning your Habuba died, I thought of my Ayuyo, the woman I was named after, Warsan Baraka, skin dark like tamarind flesh, who died grinding cardamom, waiting for her sons to come home and raise the loneliness they'd left behind. Or my mother's mother, Noura, with a honeyed laugh, who broke cinnamon barks between her palms, nursing her husband's stroke, her sister's cancer, and her own bad back with broken Swahili and stubborn Italian. And Doris, the mother of your English rose, named after the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, the Welsh in your blood, from the land of Cymru, your grandmother who dreams of clotted cream in her tea through the swell of diabetes. Then your Habuba, Al-Sura, God-keeper, with 3 lines on each cheek, a tally of surviving, the woman who cooled your tea, pouring it like the weight of deeds between bowl and cup, until the steam would rise like a ghost. There's lots of reasons why I'm drawn to this poem. I really enjoy the fact that it uses non-English terms to refer to the grandmothers. So this term Habuba in the first line is an Arabic word for grandmother that's primarily used in the Sudan. Ayiyo is the Somali word for grandmother. I love that this is set alongside Cymru, for instance, so thinking about Wales, and that these grandmothers are set aside. A Welsh grandmother, Doris. I am also fascinated with the way it uses tea. So thinking about tea thinking about drinking tea with your grandmothers, in fact, as a kind of homely act, and that this is juxtaposed with some of the really kind of traumatic experiences that these grandmothers have undergone. I also really love the imagery, so I'm drawn to phrases like skin dark like tamarind flesh, or the honeyed laugh, and the cinnamon barks, the clotted cream in her tea, so thinking about the sibilance in that and the alliteration. And then also that all of these phrases reflect or are part of a wider discourse or wider syntax, thinking of tea and what we might put in our tea. So there's lots of reasons why I'm intrigued by this poem, and lots of reasons why I'm fascinated by it. So that's Tea with Our Grandmothers.